So thank you for inviting me to this beautiful town, and now my talk on the logical concept of God's essence according to Hurtado de Mendoza. Hurtado is among those authors, as we have already heard, in early modern scholasticism, of whom important works have remained unedited, and Hurtado's main legacy can be seen in his comprehensive treatises on God, the manuscript of which are preserved at Salamanca University. Jakob Schmutzer has already analyzed and edited several passages concerning God's knowledge of the possibles. Anyway, the greatest part of these disputations have not been subject of scholarly research up to now. Hurtado's Disputationes have probably been written during the last decade of his life, and he died in 1641. So today I'm going to present a small excerpt from this work, and for this purpose I have chosen the 9th disputation concerning the logical quantitative concept of God. This subject may be interesting in several respects. First, systematically, it leads us to the question which concept of God human beings can and should have in view of the fact that we are unable to know God in himself, in his one and undivided essence. The answer to this is significant, not least because the entire scholastic tradition, as we know in recent times, has been exposed to the accusation of having distorted the personal reality of God and, the biblical doctrine through its primary ontological approach. Second, the selection might be justified with reference to Hurtado de Mendoza himself and his epoch. Explicit discussions about the metaphysical essence of God did not start before the early modern period, and thus they express a particular interest of this time. Hurtado himself has already debated the question about the conceptus quiditativus Dei, as we have heard before in the very last paragraphs of his Metaphysics, Disputatio 20, section 2. So it takes a prominent place as final discussion in his entire philosophical cursus, and therefore a comparison suggests itself between the earlier text and the considerably more detailed treatment of the same question in the Disputationes de Deo. Hurtado begins with a fundamental distinction. When we talk about the essence of God, we have to distinguish between a physical and a logical understanding of the concept. Respectively, in the terminology used in his Metaphysics, between the nature of God a parte rei and in sensu formali. This is his terminology in the earlier Metaphysics. Well understood physically, the essence encompasses whatever makes God, God, and all the determinations that must not be wanting so that something may be called God, he says. Well, it is the quantitative notion of God, independent of our understanding, which encompasses all absolute attributes, since these are not really distinct from the essence. That's the physical understanding of essence. On the other hand, essence understood logically denotes the proper concept of a thing by means of which we grasp its ground of existence and the cause of its distinction from all other things. This concept is identical with our precisive understanding of God, but it is not the uncovering of the real inner constitution of God. To this extent, the logical concept of essence, which exists only in our intellect, is incomplete. It does not encompass all real predicates, that will be the solution of Hurtado, but only those predicates, those notions which we first perceive and which appear as the cause and reason for all the others, which in comparison to this quantitative concept can be called mere secondary attributes. So the attributes are, in a strict sense, the predicates which are not encompassed in this essential understanding of God. This distinction between a physical and logical understanding of God's essence is at least rudimentary, already present in the works of Suarez. Suarez teaches that all properties of God are not merely identical with the essence, but constitute the essence in reality, and this is a view which is mostly not called into question by Jesuit scholars in the 17th century. At the same time, Suarez asks in Disputatio 30 of the Disputationes Metaphysicae, which in the ultimate sense constitutes the essence of God and quasi-specifies it, he says. This question is about the essential constitution of God as well, but according to our mode of understanding, Suarez says. However, this last mentioned topic is treated neither clearly in terms of terminology, not as a separate subject in the works of Suarez. In Jesuit treatises on God written in the first third of the 17th century, quoted by Hurtado, the question about the ultimate constitutive of the divine essence is gaining in importance and is now being discussed discreetly, mainly in the sections on the knowledge of God. A clear terminological distinction between two ways of speaking about divine essence can be found in the disputations on God's knowledge by Valentin de Erice, a colleague of Hurtado de Mendoza at Salamanca, published in 1623. In this work, Hurtado Erice mentions a duplex constitutio in divina natura, in which we have to differentiate between natura quasi physica and natura quasi metaphysica. This is the part that Hurtado has also taken and which the subsequent Jesuit school will continue. Hurtado places the topic quite at the beginning of his doctrine of God, within the chapters on God's essence in general, thus giving it greater weight. You have the list of all the disputationes in your handout. In Hurtado's preference for the term essentia logica, or logice sumpta, as alternative to essentia metaphysica, as far as I see, Hurtado has not found followers in later scholasticism, perhaps simply because his manuscripts remained widely unknown. Now Hurtado has discussed the present question by excluding solutions which, according to his conviction, remain inadequate. I don't want to comment in detail on the first two steps. The first, the relations in God do not constitute his essence. This is evident because it would cause trouble in Trinitarian theology. So this is not controversial. Scotus is referred to by his view that all attributes are to be excluded from the concept of essence. Of course, this is a consequence of formal distinction, which Hurtado has rejected in one of the former disputations. This is, at least among Jesuits, not controversial, so we can go a step further and look at a more widespread view, quoted by Hurtado without naming particular authors, a view that says that only all attributes together, so all attributes that were included in physical essence, constitute the essence of God also for our understanding, so the logical essence. In fact, this solution has also been defended by Jesuit theologians such as Bernardo de Queiroz, one generation after Hurtado. Well, we have already mentioned that Hurtado has acknowledged the relevance of all attributes together for the constitution of the physical essence. But are they necessary for the constitution of logical essence as well? The Jesuit formulates his answer in a first step on the premise of the affirmation of objective formalities in God, then on the premise of their rejection. So he goes in two steps. And he says that even in the first way, even if we accept such objective formalities in God, this view is incorrect. His first and central argument is that we can doubt singular attributes of God without missing his essence. Or, in other words, that we conceive God's essence without naming all attributes. It's enough to name certain attributes. And, well, in this quotation, Hurtado gives his own view, which he will explain further in the following sections and steps. Ut Deum concipiamus, satis est, concipere singulare completum, sive primam substantiam intellectualem in creatam. So that's enough. We don't have to give a list of all attributes, and he says, well, if this was necessary, we would never have a concept of God on earth, because this is impossible. So this must be enough, and this is enough. Well, it becomes clear at this point that for our Jesuit, the classification of God into the genus of substance, and hence in principle generic classifications of God as such, are not problematic, are not so much problematic. He has dealt with this question explicitly in his Metaphysics, which he also refers to in De Deo, and there with prominent medieval nominalists, but against the great majority of scholastic theologians, for example, Suarez, Hurtado considers this generic classification to be possible under certain circumstances. Yeah. It is possible because it is made only by our human reasoning. It is applied from outside to God and does not claim to correspond to the inner constitution of God. So it's not so big a problem. Hurtado is supporting his rejection of the thesis under discussion with a second argument. For us, it is sufficient to determine God as one who can be the subject of our worship and who, for his part, is able to return the love we are giving him. So, in addition to the adequate logical notion, Hurtado points to the fulfillment of theological criteria prescribed by Christian faith for establishing the relationship between God and man. This is an important issue for him, and Hurtado will frequently return to this argument. According to Hurtado, the objections from the perspective of those who want to include all attributes in the logical concept of divine essence become devoid of purpose if one rejects objective formalities in God. There is physically only the one undivided nature of God, which we can sufficiently grasp without naming all attributes. Well, this is independent from the question whether we acknowledge objective formalities in God or not. But if we reject them, if they are denied, in Hurtado's view, this solution gains consistency, becomes less vulnerable. For if the notions included in our logical concept of God are based exclusively on our intellect, we understand better that our concept of God does not have to be the best possible according to its modes, so he says. The only important thing is that it corresponds to the purpose we intend with this concept, to make God's essence clearly identifiable and distinguishable. That's what we need. The view concerning the logical constitutive of God most frequently taken in early modern scholasticism shares with Hurtado's view the conviction that we do not have to include all divine predicates, but unlike Hurtado, the representatives of this solution limit themselves to naming God as ens a se. That is, to stressing his ontological proprium without pointing to his intellectual nature, so without pointing to the gradus intelectivus, as Hurtado says. This view is also maintained by Jesuits at the beginning of the 17th century, as Hurtado proves by referring to the treatise on God written by the Portuguese Cristóvão Gil, who died in 1608. Hurtado does not consider this doctrine to be false, but incomplete or inadequate. He writes, quote, "I maintain that God, in his formal and logically essential concept, is being, substance, and intellect from himself, so that these three grades constitute his essence, as the essence of man is being, substance, living, and rational animal." Let's look at the reasons for his claim. They consist of a total of 3 arguments, the first of which is the fundamental one. The notion of God as actualitas per essentiam, to which the supporters of the Constitution view discussed here are referring, this notion presupposes more universal concepts which God is sharing with creatures, at least analogously. These concepts are quasi-generic and are specified by differences among which actualitas a se is not the first one. In the background stands Hurtado's logical division of being of ens, based on the scheme of the Arbor Porphyriana, to which he refers. This division had, somewhat less detailed, already been explained at the beginning of the chapter on substance in his metaphysics, and it can be represented in the following way. So ens has to be subdivided in substantia et accidens, substantia in incompleta et completa, substantia completa in spiritualis et corporea. Well, substantia corporea is now not interesting for us. Substantia completa spiritualis is either God, substantia completa spiritualis actualis per essentiam, or angel contingens in actualitate. Therefore, according to Hurtado, it's evident that being through itself, actualis per essentiam, cannot be the differentia immediata entis, nor the differentia immediata substantiae. For in this order of things, in this logical order of things, not ens is immediately per se, but only being as complete intellectual substance. Per se, as last difference, is, for example, not necessary at all to distinguish God from man, since for this purpose it would be enough to conceive God as substantia completa spiritualis. It is only for the distinction between God and angel that we need the further specification of his complete spiritual substance as being through itself. Therefore, it is logically inadequate to determine God's being simply as ens a se. The concept of substantia completa spiritualis actualis per essentiam is better and more exact because it also includes the intermediate quiditative notions. In the second argument, Hurtado points to the correspondence between the quiditative concept of man and angel and that of God. So if rationality, the gradus intelectivus, is constitutive for these beings, then intellectual life is constitutive for God as well. I will not explain it more deeply. The third argument is already known to us from Hurtado's critique of Scotus's view and other places. We can only conceive God in his essence if we conceive him as the subject of our worship and love, but then we must think of him as a spiritual, intellectual being that is capable of accepting our worship and love and responding to it. Now I will skip, because time is running, the step 4. Although this question is discussed by Hurtado in great detail and is important for him, the question whether there is a difference between God's act of understanding and his intellect as a faculty or so on. And you see he is rejecting all attempts to make such distinctions. There is no virtual production, no rational production, and here we can see the great influence of Peter Auriel in the theology of this time. So this will not be explained in greater detail. Well, he's urging me a few words at least to this question, if God's act of will and omnipotence are to be excluded in the logical concept of divine essence. Perhaps only some notices to this. Hurtado says it is clear we can distinguish between acts and objects, not only in God's knowledge, but also in his will. If we now ask if God's will is to be included in our concept, in our logical concept of God, well, Hurtado says we can come to different conclusions. On the one hand, we can say, well, there is a logical priority of knowledge over love in God. Then we may come to the conclusion that only knowledge is to be included in our concept or logical concept of God. On the other hand, there is, in the case of God, no strict causal deduction of will from knowledge. Knowledge is only a conditio sine qua non for will in God, so we need both. We need intellectivum and affectivum to understand his essence, and well, another time this argument, we need to understand God as someone who is capable of receiving our worship and our love and to give it back. And so we need a God who is able to love, to will, and in a similar way, we need, I will skip this, I will need a God who is omnipotent, because he must be able to act in the world. He must be able to get in relation to us by his providence, and this is not possible without omnipotence. So in this point we have a certain self-correction of Hurtado, because in his metaphysics he had excluded will from the quantitative concept of God, and now he is at least willing to accept it. He says it's possible. We can choose between these two solutions. Both have good arguments, but now he's more inclined to the second one, to the more extensive notion of God. So I come to my conclusion. I will finish with 4 summarizing remarks. The question about the decisive formal constitutive of God's essence, as discussed by Hurtado, has become well established in scholastic treatises on God from the 17th century. Subsequent theologians will explain in even more detail and with further aspects the different solutions mentioned by Hurtado. With his clear distinction between a physical essence of God, constituted by all attributes, and a logical essence constituted only by certain predicates, Hurtado did not introduce a totally new topic, but he has promoted and enriched the discussion in which, prior to him, the 2 dimensions of the concept of essence often had not always been sufficiently separated. In Hurtado's own view, the gradus intelectivus, primarily taken in the sense of the intelligere actuale, is undoubtedly constitutive for God's logical essence. By this, he is taking up basically identical solutions from the Jesuit school before him. We can think of Suarez, whose doctrine had already been further developed by Erice and Zúñiga in their works on God, published both in 1623, and it was Suarez who had also reflected on God's will and omnipotence as constitutive predicates of his essence. And, well, this is what Hurtado is suggesting in his treatise on God, emending or extending his previous teaching. Thus, in his solution, Hurtado is following the traces of the Doctor Ex Imius, although he does not quote him extensively, and his immediate point of reference are the above-mentioned Jesuit authors of the post-Suarezian generation. Particularly, the relationship to Erice would be interesting to investigate in a more deep way. Second point, in theological treatises after Hurtado, this view according to which the metaphysical essence of God is constituted primarily by his actual knowledge is mostly connected with the names of Fasolus and Erice. Occasionally, Hurtado is mentioned as well, but only with reference to the rather short paragraphs in his metaphysics. If his detailed doctrine on God had appeared in print, he might have received greater attention, and his own solution would have had to be classified somewhat differently, because then he probably would have been placed alongside theologians like Zúñiga, from whom the inclusion of the Volitio Actualis in the metaphysical essence was evident. Third, the topic of the Praecisiones Objective, so frequently discussed by Hurtado throughout his work, has also great presence in Disputatio 9. Hurtado knows that his refusal of them is very controversial. Maybe it is for this reason that he develops some of his arguments both with and without their assumption. He comes to the conclusion that a rejection of this premise hardly affects our understanding of the logical essence of God, but makes it easier to defend the correct solution. This can be taken as a confirmation of his own conviction. And the last point, an argument in Hurtado's disputation which is repeated several times and as far as I can see does not occur in the same way among other authors of the time, consists in his stressing the genuine theological conditions an adequate logical concept of God's essence has to meet. On the basis of Christian faith, God must be conceived as one who can enter into a living relationship with human beings. For this, he must be conceived as knowing, loving, and acting in the world. These decisive personal qualities must not be missing in our understanding of God's essence. So within the context of his metaphysical doctrine on God, Hurtado underlines the proprium of Christian theism. Realizing that our reflection on God is never able to grasp God's essence as it is in himself, we are at the same time enabled to speak of God in the same way as the Bible does, in human terms, as God for us. Thank you.